All right.
Okay, hi there. Welcome and thanks for coming. This is a talk on Andy Warhol. We're going to cover an awful lot of territory today. A lot of people think Andy Warhol, they think soup cans and not much beyond that, but I think we're going to discuss things that are going to show you that he's a very multifaceted artist and had an awful lot to say. The lecture does cram a lot of information into a short time, so it doesn't give you a lot of time to contemplate individual pieces. But I think one thing that's important to think about with Andy Warhol is that at the heart of everything, he was a commercial artist. That was what his original career was in, and that, to use the art term, informed his work throughout his career. And I think when you look at his art, it's important to notice things about layout, colors he chose, things that look intentionally blurry, things that just images that kind of fade out or whatever, the appearance and the way things are laid out and the colors and the composition of things is really important because it's like laying out an ad or something. So now let's see, I'll have to use a little arrow here to go forward. There we go. So this is who I am. This is a book I wrote that came out about 3 years ago called The Art of Looking at Art. It's a general compendium about all the questions people have about the art world. And this is my email address. I welcome questions or comments. If you have any, you can surely contact me. And I'll show this slide at the end of the presentation as well. This is my website where you can see my work, and the6hourartmajor.com has a list of all my upcoming lectures and classes. So if you want to take that down, you can as well. Now, to go to the next slide. This is probably one of the most recognizable quotes since 7 years ago. This has entered the common parlance as just something everybody knows what this means. And we've actually gotten to this time. One thing I want you to think about when we talk about the whole Andy Warhol thing is how ahead of his time he was in so many things. Reality TV, the idea of being famous for being famous, all kinds of current events and things that we're talking about now, he kind of predicted. And I think that's one of the most important things to remember about him. In the art world, pop art is a movement. It includes artists like Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, to note some of the neglected women artists, Rosalind Drexler and Marjorie Strider, also part of that movement. But for the world in general, when people hear pop art, they think of Andy Warhol. And even as his prices, paid for his work constantly shatter records, and attendance at his shows always breaks records. And frankly, this is one of my most popular lectures. People are always fascinated to hear about Warhol. People still wonder why his art is so important. And a lot of people just don't quite get what he's about. It's also interesting to think that if he were alive today, he would be nearly 100 years old. And yet people in their 20s, like, oh, Andy Warhol, Andy Warhol. He's considered kind of the epitome of cool, even though he's really a contemporary of my mother and has to be really thought of as a child of the Depression, which is what we're going to get into when we talk about his childhood. This is his childhood home in the Oakland neighborhood of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His parents were very working class. His father was a general laborer and his mother was an embroiderer. And he, like my parents, was raised during the Depression. So I relate to Andy Warhol in a lot of ways. He's also Eastern European, Catholic background like I am. And he is of the generation that my mother would be in. And I think really had the Depression era mentality. People who grew up during the Depression, I think, had a lot of concerns about money because they didn't have any when they were growing up. And he was very obsessed with money. And I think he also represents kind of the immigrant American dream because his parents were not wealthy. They were very regular people. And he fulfilled the American dream as an immigrant. So I think that's part of his childhood and his mentality that informs his work. And as a matter of fact, Campbell's soup was very important to him because he was kind of raised on it. It brings back childhood memories to him, or so he said. So this is the house he grew up in, not a big house, but to get by during the Depression, his family took in boarders. And they lived on the first floor, and the family of five lived in the upstairs. He had two older brothers, John and Paul, who did not go on to form the Beatles, but those were his older brothers. His brother Paul became a farmer, and his brother John actually ran the Warhol Foundation for a number of years. He was born on August 6th of 1928, so that's his birthday. And he's one of the few artists to have household name status. When you think about it, you think, Rembrandt, Picasso, Andy Warhol, he's that famous. So his parents were Slovakian immigrants. I already talked about what they did. He was a kind of sickly child. This is him at age 10. He had St. Vitus dance, which was sort of a nervous disorder that gave him twitches. He also had like some kind of skin discoloration. So he was picked on a lot as a kid, and he always had hangups about his looks. His father and mother, however, were very supportive of his art career, and his father managed to sock away enough money to pay for his first 2 years of art school. His father died in 1942, so he died pretty young, but his mother died in 1972, so she was around for quite a while. This is a picture of Warhol at age 17 in 1945. In 1949, so shortly after World War II ended, he moved to New York City with who would become famous figure painter Philip Pearlstein, and they were close friends. And he sought work as a commercial artist. However, he was nothing too impressive. As a matter of fact, his appearance was so kind of woebegone that he got a new nickname of Raggedy Andy. In 1951, he went to Dance Magazine looking for work. He eventually did a lot of illustrating work for them, including 2 covers. Yeah, 2 covers. He did 2 covers for the magazine, but the editor at Dance Magazine referred to him as a pathetic little thing. So he clearly was not impressive, but his work was, because it was a lot different from a lot of what was going on. He kind of had this blotted ink technique that he borrowed or stole, some might say, from an artist named Ben Shahn. Ben Shahn was a social realist painter, and social realists were kind of protest artists during the Depression. And Ben Shahn had this method of drawing an ink line and then quickly blotting it with a piece of paper so it would come out kind of spotty. And you can see it like on the bottom of the card here. We'll get a closer look at it later. But he took this line, which was kind of his signature now, and used these very bright colors, and they were very whimsical. Like here he has a bunch of shoes coming out of a flower pot growing like flowers. So at the height of his career as a commercial artist, he was earning $100,000 a year, which in today's money was like $1 million a year. So he was already quite successful as a commercial artist, and really kind of took a blow by becoming a fine artist in the beginning, because his work did not sell a lot and it was actually quite ridiculed. He did have to eventually hire assistants, including his mother, who was artistically inclined. And he never in his career stopped doing like book jackets, album covers, Christmas cards, ads. He did that stuff throughout his career, even as a fine artist. In any case, eventually, the pathetic little thing transforms himself into the coolest guy of all time, or the coolest artist of all time, Andy Warhol. And here he is with his shades and his boat neck striped t-shirt on the balcony of the Factory, which was the name of his studio. And it was called the Factory for a very specific reason, because he churned out work, using a very commercial method, of silkscreen, which we'll talk about in a couple of slides. But he produced art as if it were produced in a factory, and he really thought of his art as product. Now, this is not particularly a radical idea. If you know anything about art history, you know that most art up until modern times was produced by factories. In other words, an artist like Rembrandt would have an entire staff working for him, and he would have a hand in the painting. But sometimes an artist like Rubens, they don't even know if Rubens might have touched some of his paintings. Maybe his assistants did most of the work in his style, or he did a lot of the major figures, and the assistants would do the backgrounds, things like that. So most artwork throughout history has actually been the product of workshops. So this wasn't a particularly new idea. So this factory was located at 231 East 47th Street in Manhattan, and he was there from 1963 to 1967. So this is where Andy Warhol came from. This is the art that was around before Andy Warhol did his Coke bottles and his soup cans. Abstract expressionism was the big art movement in post-war America. And this is what put America on the map after the war. Artists like Jackson Pollock, Arshile Gorky, Lee Krasner, Willem de Kooning. And the art was all about very heavy stuff. You know, they would go to the Cedar Tavern on University Place and talk late into the night and get drunk and have brawls. And they were very macho. Even the women of abstract expressionism were very macho. It was all about these big violent gestures of painting and, you know, all about the action of painting. And they would discuss all these very heavy ideas. So you have to realize how much of a paradigm shift it is to have these very slick kind of commercial works being shown. You know, all of a sudden, like there was a big shift in the art world, and all this very heavy, thoughtful, emotional, you know, very cowboy kind of art was giving way to this very slick, commercial, colorful pop art. It was a real shift. And, you know, it really represented an enormous change that represented the change in American attitudes as well. Any questions so far? Am I going at a good pace? Let me know if you have anything.
I don't
If
have
not,
any
I'll just
questions in
move
the
on.
box yet, but again, for those of you who are joining us a little bit late, we do have the Q&A function enabled. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask during the program, feel free to type those in, or you can save them for the very end of the program and we'll do a little Q&A.
Yeah, we'll have a little discussion afterwards. So anyway, Andy Warhol had his first show from June 16th till July 3rd of 1952. And it was called 15 Drawings Based on the Writings of Truman Capote. And it was at Hugo Gallery on 55th Street and Madison Avenue in Manhattan. And yeah, so this was in 1952. And Andy Warhol was kind of captivated by Truman Capote. Oh, wait, I thought I had a slide for this. No, I don't. I did have a slide, but anyway, well, let's back up. I guess in another presentation, originally this is a 3-hour program, and this has been a little bit edited. So sometimes I forget which slides I have and which ones are in what presentation. But anyway, long story short, on the back of Truman Capote's first big novel, there was an author shot of Truman Capote lying on a couch. And you have to think of Truman Capote, who is, you know, quite effeminate and, you know, wrote very gossipy sort of books. His big famous first book was In Cold Blood, which was about a murder of a family in the Midwest. But, you know, you have to think of, you know, authors like Ernest Hemingway, once again, very macho. And along comes Truman Capote, and on the back of his album, Other Voices, other voices, other rooms. This was one of his first big novels. He's shown on the back cover looking very effeminate, very kind of come hither. And Warhol was captivated by this image of Truman Capote because in the 1950s, this was very, very transgressive. And this is another point I like to make about the whole Warhol scene, is that a lot of the people were gay. There was a lot of transgender people involved in the scene, which is another thing we're talking about now. So another way the factory was very ahead of its time. But at the time, up until like the mid 70s, homosexuality was not only a crime, it was a mental illness. And for Warhol, who was a very devout Catholic, it was also a sin. So there was a lot of baggage tied to being gay back in those days. And Warhol kind of latched onto Truman Capote almost in like a kind of stalky kind of way, to the point where Truman Capote's mother eventually told him to go away. They eventually became very good friends when they started traveling in the same circles in the 70s, when they started hanging out at Studio 54, but that's a point in the future. But Truman Capote was a little creeped out by Andy Warhol at first. So I'm showing you this drawing let's see, let me skip a bit. Yes, okay. This is a drawing that Andy Warhol did that he offered to the Museum of Modern Art, and the Museum of Modern Art turned it down. because there is something involved in taking on a piece of art. A museum that takes art is therefore responsible for it. So he did offer to give it to the Museum of Modern Art, and they turned it down. But it was his first show in a public museum. It was a drawing of American artists, a show of American drawing, a show of American drawings by American artists. Let's get the mouth working again. So this here is one of Andy Warhol's first pieces of pop art. You see, it's the comic strip Nancy, which was very big at the time. I remember it very fondly from my childhood. Unfortunately, Andy found out that there was another artist doing comic strips named Roy Lichtenstein, another pop artist. So he had to find something different to do, and he abandoned his paintings of Nancy and Dick Tracy and other comic books that he did. And he started asking some people for ideas. At one point, he offered a friend of his, or gave a friend of his, a check for $50 for coming up with the idea of painting soup cans. A friend of his named Muriel Lateau, who came up supposedly with the idea for doing soup cans. The next day after he got the idea from his friend and giving her this check for $50, he went to the supermarket and bought all the soups. In early 1962, he did his first serial works. This is called $201 bills, and it's a 20-foot by 10-foot grid of dollar bills. This is before he was silkscreening, so all of these dollar bills were actually hand-painted, and he was not yet transferring photographs. So this is one of his last hand-painted pieces, but it's the first series piece he did where he started doing replications of the same image over and over again. And I think one thing to think about with Andy Warhol is, why is he repeating this image? What does this repetition mean? And you notice that the dollar bills aren't exactly the same. Like this one's really faded, and they're all different exposures. Some of them are blurry, some of them are sharp. So that adds a little variation. And what do those variations mean? What is he trying to say by varying the image in the way he does? We'll see in the Coke bottles too later on. So silk screening, which he eventually took up to, allowed him to mass produce his art and put it out very quickly. This is a silkscreen t-shirt. Silkscreen is a very commercial kind of method. You use it for tote bags and t-shirts like this. So it really gave him the opportunity to really churn out his work. And it really was an anticipation of what we now call like surface art that easily goes onto a coffee mug or a t-shirt. So he kind of thought up that idea, was one of the first artists to come up with the idea of using a commercial method that's used for things like t-shirts, and anticipates this idea of commercial art almost that could go on some kind of surface like that. So between June and July of 1962, he painted his first Coca-Cola bottles. And once again, you see all the bottles are different. What is he trying to say by varying the image this way? And the repetition and the way they're lined up. All that's the kind of stuff to consider, I think, when you look at Andy Warhol, is what are the variations in the image and the colors he picks and the way he depicts them. What is he trying to say? It's more than just a bunch of Coke bottles. In any case, this was exhibited at his first pop show in New York at Eleanor Ward's Stable Gallery, which was located on West 58th Street in November of 1962. And I'm going to give you a quote by Andy Warhol that I think helps explain the images a little bit. I'm not sure I quite agree with the sentiment, but this is Andy Warhol's quote. "What's great about this country," and this is, once again, to me, the immigrant thing. Immigrants have a love for America that people who live here just don't have, I think, in a lot of instances, because you always say, oh, America is such a great country, and that is just from my experience, as a child of immigrant parents, my parents were first generation American. That is a very immigrant thing. Oh, the great country, America, the great country. What's great about this country is that America started the tradition where the richest consumers buy essentially the same things as the poorest. You can be watching TV and see Coca-Cola, and you know that the president drinks Coke, Liz Taylor drinks Cokes, and just think, you can drink Coke too. A Coke is a Coke, and no amount of money can get you a better Coke than the one the bum on the corner is drinking. So that's another thing I think to keep in mind with Andy Warhol is the kind of egalitarian spirit that his art and the factory scene was all about. We'll get into that shortly too. But the idea here is that he's bringing common everyday objects that everybody knows onto the walls of museums. And it was kind of considered very inappropriate at the time, just the same way at one point in the 1800s, scenes of daily life were considered radical because art was supposed to be about these big, grand things like, gods and heroes. And then all of a sudden, people in the 1800s started doing paintings of real people. It was very radical. And the same thing here, like this is commercial art, and it wasn't considered suitable for the walls of a gallery or a museum. So, moving apace, so far so good. Between July 9th, July 9th and August 4th of 1962, he had his first solo pop exhibition at Irving Bloom's Ferris Gallery in Los Angeles on La Cienega Boulevard in West Hollywood. Warhol was at first hesitant to show at this gallery, but Irving Bloom convinced him that the celebrities were just going to turn out and it was going to be incredibly fabulous. It was a total lie because no celebrities ever came into this gallery. Oddly enough, when he did give the opening, a bunch of celebrities did show up. Let's see. Yeah, that's who showed up. I have a list of here. Yes, Robert Dean Stockwell, Peter Fonda, Troy Donahue, and Suzanne Plachette all appeared at the opening. So even though it was a total fabrication that these celebrities were going to show up, they did eventually show up. So let's see, these were 32 different flavors of soup cans. Bloom's partner, Walter Hopps, asked Warhol what he was saying with the paintings, and Warhol hesitated for a moment and said, "I think they're portraits, don't you?" Which I think is a really interesting take because there is something kind of portraity about them. And the way Walter Hopps took it was that Andy Warhol couldn't kind of distinguish between people and things. So in any case, the story about this is really interesting. A nearby supermarket piled up real Campbell's soup cans in their window and said, "Here, you can have the real thing for 29 cents a can." The local critics panned the show. They thought it was garbage. The LA Times featured a cartoon of two barefoot beatniks looking into the gallery window. And one of them is saying, "Frankly, the cream of asparagus does nothing for me, but the terrifying intensity of the chicken noodle gives me a real Zen feeling." So this show was totally mocked. And 4 of the pieces, however, did sell for $100 a piece. And one was on hold. Irving Bloom canceled the sales and took back the one that was on hold and bought the whole collection for $1,000. He paid it off at $100 a month. Eventually, he sold them to the Museum of Modern Art for $15 million. So it's a really wise investment. In May of 1964, Campbell Soup wrote Andy Warhol, and they told him that they admired his work a great deal and sent him a couple of cases of tomato soup. In August of 1962, he started doing his first movie stars, including Elvis Presley, and from here on in, he never stops painting celebrities. On the advice of the art critic, Henry Geldsaler, who is also a curator, who told Andy Warhol he really needed to add a little bit of substance to his work, he launched his Death and Disaster series. This is in the summer of 1962. And it began with this painting, 129 Die in Jet, and this is based on a real story. This is another thing about Warhol, is that very often he commented on current events in his work. So this is another quote. "I guess it was the big plane crash picture, the front page of the newspaper, 129 die. I was also painting the Marilyns, Marilyn Monroe clearly. I realized that everything I was doing must have been death. It was Christmas or Labor Day, a holiday, and every time you turned on the radio, they said something like 4 million are going to die. That started it. But when you see a gruesome picture over and over again, it really doesn't have any effect." So he's kind of talking about the banality of evil idea. So these are some other works in the series. Suicide, Fallen Body. This was based on a woman who jumped from the top of the Empire State Building and landed on a car hood, crushing it in. But she landed in this beautiful languorous pose, and she was all dolled up like a movie star. And so there was a spread on this in Life magazine, and they called her the most beautiful corpse. There was also the tuna fish disaster, where some housewives were killed by tainted tuna. And there was the electric chair. Now, talk about iconic, because that's another thing to think about with Andy Warhol, is that he did a lot of iconic pieces, things that were really famous and well known. As a matter of fact, the Death and Disaster series was the only time he ever painted regular people. Mostly it was things that everybody knew. And this electric chair even is iconic, because this is the electric chair that the Rosenbergs were executed in. The Rosenbergs were accused of selling espionage secrets to the Soviets, and this is their electric chair. So even that is iconic. He also did paintings of race riots, because this is when the civil rights movement is starting to take off. And once again, he's very on top of current events. In 1962, late in the year, during the Death and Disaster series, he starts using a Polaroid land camera, and he starts with some Polaroids of dispassionate male nudes. In 1971, so we're moving ahead a few years, he buys a big shot Polaroid camera to take pictures of people, celebrities mostly, and people, factory hangers-on. And in these instances, the subjects of these Polaroids, and I think people who are around at a certain time recognize just about everybody in these photographs. They're all very famous people. And up here, it's interesting. Here's Andy Warhol himself in drag. But he has, Dolly Parton, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Wayne Gretzky, who's a hockey player. So celebrities of all types. So when he took these Polaroids, he would wine and dine the people, have them give them an interview, which was recorded, and, style them, and very often put a lot of white makeup on them to kind of flatten out the shadows to prepare them for the silkscreen portraits that would be taken from them. So it was a whole big deal to get these Polaroids taken. Next slide. In May of 1963, the dealer Ileana Sonnabend visits Warhol in his studio. She was the ex-wife of the art dealer Leo Castelli. She wound up opening her own art gallery in Paris after she and Castelli divorced in 1959. And 3 of Warhol's paintings were exhibited in a 1963 group show called Pop Américain. So it was a French show of American pop art. And it was, I think, Europe's probably first exposure to pop art. The Mona Lisa came to New York that year and to Washington, D.C. So once again, it's a current event. And Andy Warhol responded by doing a series of his own Mona Lisa silkscreens. And once again, you see it's sideways, it's upside down, it's in black and white, it's in color. Why, it's in yellow, it's in red. What do the colors signify exactly? Why do you think he portrayed it this way? I think those are the kinds of things. And then he has a close-up of the hands. So I think all those little details and how the subtle little changes he makes of things to look into, to think about when you look at Andy Warhol's work. Okay, next slide. So far, so good? All right, then. In early 1963, in the spring, he did a photo spread for Harper's Bazaar magazine. He took a bunch of photo booth photos, and the magazine thought that they were completely wrong in the absolutely right way. Because, they were, photo booth photos, they came out really crummy back in those days. They weren't like now, they're like almost like laser perfect. But back then, they were kind of cheesy looking. And the magazine thought that they were perfect in the absolute, wrong in the absolutely perfectly right way. And this led to his first portrait commission of a socialite named, whose name was Ethel Skull. And she and her husband were art collectors, and he took her to a photo booth. He took over 300 photos in the session, and they chose a bunch of them, and they made them into this commission portrait. What's interesting about this portrait is that the couple eventually divorced, So this painting is jointly owned by the Whitney Museum and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, because one was on one board and one was on the other board. So both museums actually own this painting. In July of 1963, he bought a movie camera, which allowed for 1 3-minute take. And he did a movie called Sleep, starring a poet named John Giorno, who was a stockbroker and dropped out of straight society to become a poet. And this movie lasts 5 hours and 20 minutes and is edited with a lot of repeat footage, but it's basically just a 5-hour, 20-minute movie of someone sleeping. And when you think about it, once again, sleep is kind of iconic. We all do it. It's something everybody knows. So that's something to think about as well. Some of the other movies in that year include Kiss, in which various couples make out for 3.5 minutes each. Haircut, which is based on hair cutting parties that a factory habitué named Billy Name. This factory habitué named Billy Name used to give hair cutting parties in his loft. And so Andy Warhol did a movie called Haircut. And then there's a movie called Eat, which lasted for 45 minutes. It was absolutely silent. And it shows the painter Robert Indiana eating a mushroom. And at the end of the movie, a cat walks across the frame, and that's the movie. So I'm going to read another quote from Warhol, which helps explain why he did these movies, which were kind of unlike anything anybody had ever done before. And eventually movie making plays more and more of a part in his oeuvre, to use the art term, in his work. And this is about his movie Blue Movie, which was kind of a softcore porn movie. And it's called Blue Movie because he used the wrong kind of film for the time of day it was. So the movie actually is a blue movie in that it's literally blue, like it has a blue coloration to it. So with regard to that movie, what Andy Warhol said was, "Scripts bore me. It's much more exciting not to know what's going to happen. If you see a movie or two people talking, you can watch it over and over again without being bored. You get involved, you miss things, you come back to it, but you can't see the same movie over and over again if it has a plot because you already know the ending. Years ago, people used to sit looking out of their windows at the street. They would stay for hours without being bored, although nothing much was going on. This is my favorite theme in movie making, just watching something happening for 2 hours or so. I still think it's nice to care about people, and Hollywood movies are uncaring." So in late 1963, he moved his studio to East 47th Street, the one we looked at before, where he was on the balcony here, see? And this is on East 47th Street. And this was the Silver Factory. The reason it was called the Silver Factory, because it was the entire interior was either silver painted or covered in aluminum foil. Part of the reason might have been that silver makes a really good backdrop for photography, apparently. I don't know much about photography, but it's something I've heard. But also, apparently, there were a lot of people taking a lot of amphetamines at the time. There were a lot of drugs, a lot of interesting behavior going on at the time, a lot of debauchery. Let's just be frank about it. And it's really an interesting concept. Andy Warhol was very strictly Catholic, very religious, went to church every day. And, meanwhile, there's all this debauchery going on at the factory. But apparently the silver aesthetic appeals to people who take a lot of amphetamines. And at the time, amphetamines and sleeping pills, pep pills, diet pills, sleeping pills, basically amphetamines and barbiturates, were part of everyday life. A lot of people took them. It was pretty common practice, and they weren't thought to be harmful because they were prescribed by doctors. But they were really addictive. And apparently the silver aesthetic of seeing a lot of silver shiny things appeals to speed freaks a lot. They like seeing silver shiny things. Wouldn't know from experience, but that's something I've heard. In any case, he also did some very interesting portraits called screen tests. Anybody who happened to walk into the factory was subject to being the subject of what he called a screen test. They were shot at 2 3/4 minutes, and they were slowed down so they lasted 4 minutes. And they're a really interesting concept because they're literally living portraits. The instructions were to just sit still and look at the camera. Not everybody obeyed. Different people did different things. Some people did just stare into the camera, like Anne Buchanan, who is a beat poet. She actually just starts crying. Tears just roll down her eyes just from looking straight into the camera. Kelly Eady was a factory habitué and just part of the scene, and also a renowned horologist. His collection of clocks is now in the collection of the Frick Museum. So these are some examples of the screen test, but they are portraits, but they're living portraits. So they're very interesting in that way. And they were celebrities, you know, factory superstars, you know, anonymous strangers, anybody who happened to wander in. He kept painting, but he also around this time started doing his first sculptural work. And what's interesting to me about these Brillo boxes, also Mott's applesauce and Heinz ketchup, is that they're wood and they're solid and you can't open them. It's not about the product or what's inside. It's about the packaging. It's about the surface. It's about the way they're marketed and the colors and things like that. So he still was painting. He was doing like Elvis, Jacqueline Onassis, and a bunch of self-portraits, but he also did these painted wood sculptures for the first time. He also bought a tape recorder and started carrying around with him everywhere and started recording all kinds of interviews and conversations he was having. So there is a vast array of Warhol stuff in the world. We got to start moving at pace because we're only in the 60s and he dies in the 80s. So anyway, he had a happy period in 1964 and started painting these flowers, which were exhibited at Leo Castelli Gallery, Ileana Sonnabend's ex-husband, which is interesting. And they were taken from a how-to issue of Modern Photography magazine. The magazine's editor threatened to sue because he took this image and appropriated it, although he did doctor it. And because of that, he stopped using other people's images so much. He offered to give the magazine a bunch of these paintings in lieu of a lawsuit, and they turned them down. And he did have a cash settlement, but he, from then on, started using more of his own images in his artwork. He also announced his retirement from painting and started concentrating more on movies like Empire, which is an 8-hour and 5-minute silent view of the Empire State Building on a summer night in 1964, which was slowed down once again to make the changes in the light and what was happening on the Empire State Building more apparent. Did a whole bunch of other films during this year as well. Any of these films, if you're looking for stuff like plot, character development, production values, political correctness, glossy finish, any of that stuff you usually expect in movies, forget it. These are just like plant a camera and people start talking about whatever. And a lot of the people at the factory said that they felt compelled to talk because there was a camera on and there was no script and they had to fill up the time somehow. So they would just start talking about whatever. By this time, the factory is officially a scene, and you can see all types here. You see socialites, you see downtown arty types, you see somebody actually drove their little Vespa into the factory, I don't know, probably on the elevator or something. So you see it's a real mix of like the upper crust with literally street life. Once again, a lot of these people are literally, like the author Fran Lebowitz once said, criminals. In those days, the idea of cross-dressing, you could get arrested for it. You know, if you were caught by the police, they did a raid on a gay bar and you were caught, you know, your name would be published in the paper, your wife would get the kids in the house and your career was ruined, your life was pretty much over. So you have to realize how, you know, that a lot of the people hanging out at the factory, the drag queens, the street people who probably would have had nowhere else to go, were literally criminals, and here they are mixing with Upper East Siders. So it was really kind of the first time, once again, that democratic thing I was talking about is happening. Truman Capote was kind of also doing the same thing around the same time, kind of mixing the upper crust with, like what Ann Landers once said, the upper crust mixing with the crumbs. You know, so it's like the idea of really mixing different aspects of society. Now, here's a quote from Billy Name, the guy who gave the haircutting parties. The popular impression is much more sensational. We had to work every day. We had to make films, we had to make art. The sensational view, that was just the appearance. All the work, that was in the background. That's not what it was like. We were working in an artist's studio. In December of 1965, Mickey Ruskin opened Max's Kansas City on Lower Park Avenue, which now I think is a Burger King or something. I forget what's there, but it was the scene. And it was a music venue where all the latest bands played, and Andy Warhol held court in the back room. And here you see him with the filmmaker Paul Morrissey and Janis Joplin and Tim Buckley, another singer-songwriter. So this was the scene in New York. He also made more movies. He purchased an Oricon sound on film camera. So, they did have actual sound. He's making sound movies for the first time, and they featured various factory superstars. He's the one who also popularized that term. It had been around since the 1930s, but the word superstar really came into vogue when Andy Warhol started using it. So, they were just kind of scenarios. Usually a poet named Ron Tavel would come up with some kind of scenario, and just whatever happened, happened. So these are some of the movies. My Hustler was shot on Fire Island, and it's about a male callboy who's pursued by customers of both sexes. And then there's The Life of Juanita Castro, which is a camp political farce set in Cuba with the male parts all played by women. Horse is a homoerotic, very dark kind of Western. And Poor Little Rich Girl chronicles the life of Edie Sedgwick, another factory superstar. It was taken from the name of a Shirley Temple movie, and Edie Sedgwick really was the poor little rich girl. She had a very tragic life, died very early of a drug overdose. She was constantly high, but she came from a very, very wealthy family, very established family. And this is a movie kind of chronicling her real life. So once again, Warhol is kind of presupposing reality TV, along with I don't know if anybody remembers the series that was on PBS a couple of years later, An American Family. That was another one of the first examples of reality TV in the 60s and 70s. He also made other sculptures, and these are sculptures like nobody had ever seen before. The Silver Pillows, the Silver Clouds. These are from the 1966, and they were used as decor for a Merce Cunningham dance performance, and they were also exhibited in a gallery, along with these cows. And they were displayed at Castelli Gallery, and the cows were wallpaper in another room. But the Silver Clouds were, these kind of air-filled sculptures, once again, 3D works that just kind of floated around the room. So kind of rethinks the whole idea of what sculpture is. Also, he started making more, let's back up. He started making more movies, including Hetty from 1966, which is a camp melodrama in which Mariam Montez, a drag queen, plays Hetty Lamar after the movie star Hetty Lamar after she was arrested for shoplifting. And then there was a movie called Kitchen, which takes place in the New York City kitchen of the sound band for Warhol's movies named Bud Wirtschafter. And also from 1966, Chelsea Girls, which follows the lives of 7 women who live at the Chelsea Hotel on 23rd Street. So these are, once again, reality TV. Now we're going to talk about how Warhol is relevant to all the discussion we're doing now about transgender issues and sexual identity and gender identity and identity in politics in general. These are 3 of Andy Warhol's transgender or drag superstars. First of all is Candy Darling, who was a transgender, born James Slattery in Forest Hills, Queens, and died sadly at the age of 29 in 1974 from lymphoma, possibly brought on by an injection of hormones or breast implants. But James Slattery was Candy Darling and actually worked for a while as a secretary and passed as a real woman. There's also Jackie Curtis, who defines what we now call, gender fluid or something, who did not identify as anything except as Jackie Curtis, as you can see from the quote here. And there's also Holly Woodlawn, who is a Puerto Rican guy from Miami, Florida, who came to New York and added a whole element of Hollywood glamour to the factory that previously wasn't really there. And so they have these really interesting quotes. And so this is once again Andy Warhol relating to our own time. So in 1968, he moved the studio to Union Square West. And at the time, Union Square was kind of very run down. It was not the farmers market friendly Union Square that's there now. It really was a needle park and really quite dangerous. So this is where the factory is, on the west side of Union Square Park. And on June 3rd of 1968, Andy Warhol is shot by a woman named Valerie Solanas, who was a factory habitué. And she shot Warhol and Mario Amaya, who was an art critic and curator. She was a radical lesbian feminist who invented an organization called SCUM, the Society for Cutting Up Men. And she published a manifesto which called for the overthrow of the government, the elimination of the money system, the institution of complete automation, and the destruction of the male sex. And I suppose thereby the destruction of the human race, possibly. But she had this idea in her head that Andy Warhol was going to produce one of her plays. She also had the idea that her publisher of the SCUM Manifesto was going to publish everything she ever wrote, which, as someone who wrote a book, I can tell you is not necessarily true. So she came into the factory and just shot Warhol on the spot. She accused him of turning down one of her plays and lying to her. So Andy Warhol was shot, and it made headlines. Interestingly enough, Warhol allowed himself to be photographed wearing a truss. For the rest of his life, he was never the same. And the portrait painter Alice Neel actually painted him without his shirt on, all stitched up wearing his truss, which is once again, a really interesting dichotomy because he always had big hangups about his looks. In any case, we have more movies, including what is called the Morrissey trilogy, because Paul Morrissey, the filmmaker he was hanging out earlier with at Max's Kansas City, started taking over more and more responsibility for Warhol's films, and he was the de facto director, and Andy Warhol kind of just attached himself as an overseer. But the Morrissey trilogy consists of Flesh, Heat, and Flesh, Heat, and what was the other one? I forget. Trash was the other one. Trash, Heat, and Flesh were the three movies that Paul Morrissey directed under Warhol's auspices, and they were very, very, very interesting movies. Let's put it that way. They all had plots by this time. They're getting a lot slicker, but once again, politically correct by today's standards, not at all. But they were nowhere near mainstream movies, but the most mainstream movies that came out under Warhol's name. Heat, for instance, was a parody of the old Hollywood movie from the 50s, Sunset Boulevard, which starred Gloria Swanson as an aging movie actress, and this was a parody of that movie. In November of 1969, Andy Warhol becomes a magazine publisher as well, but putting out the magazine Interview, which originally started as a film journal, but eventually became the gossip magazine of the era. I mean, it was the people of the era, and everybody who wanted to know anything about what was going on in New York read Interview magazine, but it also shows his continuing attachment to movies. In 1970, there's an extensive Warhol retrospective that toured the US and Europe, and this is the cover from the catalog at the Tate Gallery in London, showing one of his Marilyns. That same year, a hand-painted Campbell's soup can was auctioned for $60,000, which was a record at the time for a living artist. $60,000 by today's standards, where paintings are going for, $500 million seems almost kind of silly, but back in those days, $60,000 was an awful lot of money. In 1971, he starts increasing his portrait commissions. This one's called An American Lady, Kate Fortson, and this is from 1976. She was a Texas society dame. And once again, as you can see, her portrait is taken from a Polaroid. And he also made his famous quote at this time that he would paint anyone for $25,000. Any questions in the chat box so far? Is everybody still hanging on? I hope so. Feel free to interrupt with any questions, or I guess we'll just hold out for discussion afterwards.
Yeah, no questions so far.
Okay, so I hope everybody's just hanging on with me. All right, so in 1972, coinciding with President Nixon's visit to China, he did an enormous painting of Chairman Mao, because President Nixon, one good thing he did do, or maybe good thing, we still haven't figured that out, but he did open relations with China. And so, responding to current events, Andy Warhol painted this huge painting of Chairman Mao, but he seems to be wearing makeup, which is kind of an interesting statement, I think. He's got rouge, he's got lipstick, he's got eyeshadow on. Also, you notice that there's hand-painted touches. It's not just the silkscreen. So that, once again, is kind of a hands-on thing that Andy Warhol hadn't done for a while. So once again, he's responding to current events. He also, that same year, did a poster, designed a post, or let's see, yes. He created a lurid silkscreen of Richard Nixon that same year to show his support for Nixon's, the Democratic candidate that year, which was George McGovern. So to show his political leanings, besides doing the Mao, he also did a very lurid silkscreen of Richard Nixon. More Morrissey movies came out in 1972. Including Heat, like I said, a satire on Hollywood Boulevard. Also, two horror movies, Frankenstein and Dracula. These two movies are exceedingly sex-filled and extremely gory. I mean, really blood-drenched. You have to remember, this is the era of kind of like slasher movies, and midnight movies were a big popular thing in the early 70s. And they're keeping up with that trend right there. So they're very violent retellings of these classic horror stories. Blood for Dracula has an interesting spin, and it takes place in the 70s. So where Dracula needs to have virgin blood, the problem is he can't find any virgins. So that's what the whole kind of the plot of the movie. And it takes place right before the rise of Mussolini in Italy. That's when the movie is set. So he moves it up more to the pre-World War II era. In March of 1974, Andy Warhol signed a book contract with Harcourt Brace Janovich for 2 books. One was to be written with his friend, the movie star Paulette Goddard, but it was never finished because he said Paulette Goddard did not offer him enough gossip to make an entire book. But he did put out The Philosophy of Andy Warhol from A to B and Back Again. And this was culled from taped interviews that were done by a ghostwriter named Pat Hackett, and the book was released in 1975. In September of 1974, the factory moved to 860 Broadway, which is on the north side of Union Square Park. So basically moved around the corner to 17th Street, the north side of the park. And he also did a series called Ladies and Gentlemen, which I think is a brilliant title for portraits of drag queens. And this was shown at the Palazzo di Diamante in Ferrara, Italy. And these paintings were never exhibited in the US during Warhol's lifetime. Only prints of these paintings were ever seen in the US. Also in 1976, he does another very iconic image, which is very related to art history. He does a series of skulls, and this goes way, way back, thousands of years in art history, what's called the memento mori, a reminder of death. You know, skulls figured very prominently in like 17th century Dutch master paintings, you know, because that was part of the Protestant ethic in 17th century Holland and places like that. You know, they would show these paintings of sumptuous feasts, and there would be a burned out candle to show that everything was temporary. So the memento mori has a very long tradition in art, and Andy Warhol is picking up on that. Now to the part of Andy Warhol that a lot of people think about, the Studio 54 years. In April 26th of 1977, Studio 54 opened, and Andy Warhol starts hanging out with a better class of degenerates, as I put it. Studio 54, I saw a documentary on it. It was a complete fluke, actually. Steve Rubell and Ian Schrager just kind of decided to open a club in a neighborhood that nobody would ever think of opening a club in. And they just kind of sent invitations to everybody. And it was just kind of done really on the fly. They put the whole club together in a couple of weeks, invited everybody in the world. And oddly enough, everybody in the world came. And it became this huge sensation. And, you know, these photographs illustrate the kind of people Andy Warhol is now hanging out with. You know, Calvin Klein, Brooke Shields, there's Steve Rubella, Jerry Hall, the model, Deborah Harry from the pop group Blondie, there's Truman Capote, Paloma Picasso. And I love this picture of him getting stereo gossip between Liza Minnelli and Bianca Jagger. So, you know, this is a whole scene, and he kept meticulous diaries of this whole time, which we'll get into a little later. In the autumn of 1977, he did 2 series of male nudes. One was called Torsos, which this is from, were a bit tamer. And then he did another series called Sex Parts, which were a lot more hardcore. And for the sake of, you know, sake of discretion, I'm not showing those in this particular slideshow, but you can imagine. And it was revisiting a theme that he kind of did since the 1950s, but he couldn't show paintings like this back in the 1950s. So once again, he's dealing with an age-old question that goes all the way back to ancient Rome even. I remember my mother coming back on a trip to Italy where she went to Pompeii. She's like, oh, Eugene, the pornography there. You wouldn't believe it. And, you know, the line between what's art and what's pornography goes back thousands of years. And he's asking that question once again. 1978, he does his Oxidation series. And this is his first series of non-representational work, meaning they weren't about anything. And what they are kind of a sly reference to abstract expressionism, which was all about the gesture, except what he's doing here is that these huge canvases were covered with a metallic paint that would, you know, form a kind of patina and form these patterns when people urinated on them. So that's how these paintings were accomplished, by people urinating on these metal paint treated canvases. And it was kind of his send up of abstract expressionism, which was the movement that he followed. When you think about it, it's kind of very interesting statement. Also in 1979, he founded the New York Academy of Art, which is a school that I went to myself when I first started studying art. And this is, you know, I was going to art school. You know, I went back to school after I graduated college with a theater degree. And this is when the East Village art scene is raging in the East Village. And there's all this, you know, neo-expressionist art, and it's all this a lot of it was very kind of purposely crude, and a lot of it was very political. And it was a huge scene going on. And in the middle of all this, you know, kind of neo-expressionist art and neo-geo art and all these experimental kind of forms going on, he helps found a very academic, almost Renaissance style art school. And it was the kind of school where you spent 6 weeks on one drawing and really studied every aspect of anatomy. And that was a really bold move, because figurative art really was considered totally passé in the 60s and early 70s. So that's part of the reason also Warhol was immediately welcomed into the art world. And Philip Pearlstein was kind of grudgingly accepted because he was painting new, you know, remember Pearlstein and Warhol moved to New York together. Pearlstein did these kind of dead looking nudes that were clearly models posing in a studio and didn't pretend to be anything else. So that kind of was interesting, but most figurative art in the 70s was really looked down upon. So founding an artistic school that dealt in, classical figurative art was really quite radical. In 1979, he also did some abstract works called shadows. We don't know what they're shadows of, but they're positive and negative shadows from an unknown source. And it's a monumental piece consisting of 102 parts. The original installation consisted of 83 panels that were 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide. So 83 panels that were 4 feet wide. That's a really big installation. In 1979, he also we're at the hour mark now. We're going to run a little bit over, but we're closing in on the end. So he did in 1979 his retrospective and reversal series. He used the same silk screens from 15 years earlier, except he did them as negative images. So that's a really interesting concept. It's kind of a greatest hits, but they're reversed. And they have an entirely different feeling. I mean, think about what this Marilyn looks like compared to the older Marilyns, or this Mal compared to the other Mal we just looked at. So it's a really interesting statement. Now, a lot of people think that around this time, Andy Warhol really started to lose relevance, and that opinion has since been revised. I'm not going to come in on either side. I'm going to let you think about it by looking at the art that he did in the late 70s and the 80s. And we're going to start by looking, he started out the late 70s by doing a greatest hits series. In 1980, he also had his first talk show on cable TV that ran until 1982. And it was called Andy Warhol's TV. And it was a TV companion to Interview magazine. So he interviewed on the show, for instance, the pop star Grace Jones, Deborah Harry from the group Blondie, Paloma Picasso was on the show, Cindy Sherman, the 80s photographer, the composer Philip Glass, Keith Haring, the graffiti artist, and oddly enough, CZ Guest, who was a very Upper East Side kind of old-timey socialite. He also interviewed Georgia O'Keeffe, which seems like a very odd combination. Also, there were 4 episodes of another TV show, which made it actually to MTV, the cable net, the music television network, but there were only 4 episodes that were aired before he died. In 1981, he did a very interesting series of crosses, dollar signs, guns, and knives. And you think about the current conversation going on in America, think about, crosses, guns, money, it's what we're talking about now in great detail. So I think these are kind of iconic American images. There's a quote going around now, America is a gun. People, with all the shootings and stuff, people really are starting to think that guns almost symbolize America. So once again, he's way, way ahead of his time. I think this is one of his most interesting pieces, maybe my favorite Andy Warhol piece of all time, because of the title and the way it's laid out. If you look, he's got his own portrait here, and he's facing us in a classical 3/4 profile, which is how almost all classical portraits are done. But then his shadow is looking at these other portraits. And the title of this piece is called American Myths. And when you think about what a myth is either something that's so amazing, you almost can't believe it's real, or it's something that's totally fictitious. And look at who he chooses to represent American myths. Greta Garbo, who's a movie star, but not even American. Uncle Sam, Superman, the Wicked Witch of the West, a Mammy character, Howdy Doody, who's a 50s, childhood TV show, Dracula. But this is, I think, a current Dracula. I think that's Raul Julia playing Dracula at the Public Theater, Mickey Mouse and Santa Claus. So this is who he picks to represent American myths. In the 1980s, he starts working with a lot of younger artists. Like I said, the scene had shifted downtown to the East Village, East Greenwich Village. And the club scene moved to like the Mud Club, Danceteria, and a lot of the clubs moved downtown. Studio 54 closed because the owners were busted for tax evasion. And he starts moving downtown and working with and collaborating with a lot of younger artists like Keith Haring and Jean-Michel Basquiat, who looked up to him as sort of a mentor, because a lot of their art was about pop culture as well. And Jean-Michel Basquiat, incidentally, died in 1988 of a drug overdose at age 27, and Keith Haring would die in the early 90s of AIDS-related complications. 1984. So this is a piece he did with Keith Haring. I forgot this slide was in there. Sorry. He also did a series of the reigning queens of the world, the 4 reigning queens, Queen Elizabeth. This is Queen Ntombi Twala of Swaziland, which is now referred to as Eswatini. He also did the Queen of the Netherlands and the Queen of Sweden. A special edition of these paintings was sprinkled with diamond dust. And if you think about it, they're kind of like stamps or dollar bills, the same images you would see on currency or something. So by now he's done celebrities in pretty much every character. In 1985, he actually made a cameo appearance on the TV show Love Boat. He was also one of the first, this is a series he did called Rorschach Tests. This is interesting because he had no idea that Rorschach tests were done already and patients looked at him. He thought the psychiatric patients made their own Rorschach tests. So he created his own Rorschach tests, but it's a really interesting take because he painted them and they actually are Rorschach tests. What you read into them says a lot about you. So it's an interesting play between the viewer and the artist, okay? He, once again, never stopped doing album covers. This shows his blotted ink technique really well. This is an early album cover did, and these are some later ones he did all the way up into the 1980s. Also did a lot of book covers. You see from the 50s all the way to the 80s, Christmas cards, one from the 50s or 60s all the way up into the 80s, and ads. He took part in the Absolute Vodka campaign. And this is another interesting piece because he's presenting actual ads as art. Not just the product, but the actual ads. So this is another new piece he did. And this is in 1986 or so, yes, 1986. Also one of the first artists to use a computer. He actually got his first Apple computer directly from Steve Jobs and was one of the first artists. Here he's with Deborah Harry again, working on a video. He also did a series in 1986 of camouflage pictures, including a self-portrait and a version of The Last Supper done with camouflage. Think about the symbolism of camouflage and using it for a religious painting and for a self-portrait. It's a very interesting kind of juxtaposition. So on February 14th of 1987, he felt a pain in his right side and was told that he needed to go see a doctor. He delayed the appointment and wound up eventually going into the hospital 5 days later to have surgery on his gallbladder on February 21st of 1987. And he died the next day of a heart attack. This is one of his last pieces. By the way, I forgot this slide was here as well. One of the last pieces he worked on was a revamping of the Mona Lisa, which he had already done, as we know, and also The Last Supper. So he takes Leonardo da Vinci's most famous secular painting and his most famous religious paintings and reworks them in a Warhol style. So now we're talking about his death. And once again, it made headlines. Poor David Susskind, the TV talk show host, died on the same day. And look where he is. Poor guy. I mean, Warhol gets the front page with Dionne Warwick. So he died of a heart attack, even though his condition in the hospital was stable. There was a lawsuit claiming that he was neglected by the hospital staff, and they settled for $3 million out of court. His memorial was given at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. You can see it was a total mob scene. Also, there was an auction of his belongings in 1988 in May, and Sotheby's raised over $25 million. A collection of his kitschy cookie jars from the 1940s and 50s alone fetched $250,000. despite the fact that if they weren't Warhol's cookie jars, they would be cookie jars. So the fact that they belonged to Warhol really brought in a lot of money. In 2013, one of his silver car crashes, double disasters, that from his Death and Disaster series, sold for 105.4 million, and that was the second most expensive piece of art ever auctioned, according to Sotheby's. His diaries came out in 1989. They were published posthumously, and this was the book that everyone was reading, full of lots of gossip. He also kept track of every single cab fare he ever spent. So it shows, once again, his obsession with spending. In 2012, Campbell Soup unveiled a limited edition style, Warhol-style series of soup cans of their own to mark the 50th anniversary of the first soup cans that Warhol did. So I just want to cover quickly his legacy, and then we can take the next couple of minutes for you to throw in your comments. Clearly, we've gotten a little bit over time, but I'm personally not going anywhere. Like I said, it's 10 o'clock, it's 11 o'clock plus here in New Jersey. I'm not going anywhere. So if we go a little later, it's fine by me. But I just want to run through what I think of his general legacy and then finish with a quote by Warhol that kind of explains his legacy as well. First of all, I think with all the areas Andy Warhol covered, there's an Andy for everybody. Money people relate to him, art people relate to him, fashion people relate to him, transgender people relate to him. He represents an entire cultural cross-section of America mid-century. He painted anybody who is anybody from every level of society. He invented the idea of fame for being famous. He knew how to manipulate the media like nobody else. And his paintings, like I said, are a complete time capsule of the latter part of the 20th century. Also, we talked about how he democratized art in New York, which is the major, New York and LA are the reinvention capitals of the world, as far as I'm concerned. You can come from Nowheresville, nowhere state, and if you're cool enough, you can become a superstar in those two places. And Andy Warhol really democratized that idea. A lot of the people he was hanging out with were literally street people, and he turned them into something like celebrities. And so the factory was very democratic. Besides, the art was very democratic. It was stuff people see in everyday life. His images, which were based on iconic images, have become icons in their own right in a world that's still fascinated by American pop culture. Because there's one thing Americans still have, it's our pop culture. He reasserted the power of images and how long-lived they are. He was also full of contradictions. He was a star, but he was also in the background. He was a voyeur and an observer, but he was also a star, very out there in public. He was devoutly religious, but surrounded by all this debauchery. He was an artist, but also a major capitalist. He seemed to have a very love-hate relationship with fame. And I think he really understood America. And that's why I think he's one of the most American artists out there, is because he really understood the idea of American culture and pop culture and what we represent to the world. And he captured all different aspects of American life. Remember, he not only did soup cans, he did race riots, he did a lot of current events, he did a lot of celebrities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to finish up with a quote by Andy Warhol, and that's where we will finish, and then we will open up to any discussions or questions people have. Quote from Andy Warhol: "Everybody has their own America, and they have pieces of a fantasy America that they think is out there, but they can't see. When I was little, I never left Pennsylvania, and I used to have fantasies about things that I thought were happening, that I felt I was missing out on. But you can only live life in one place at a time. You live in your dream America that you've custom made from art and schmaltz and emotions just as much as you live in your real one." So that's where we end. Does anybody have anything to say or any questions or comments? Are people rethinking Warhol now that they've seen this lecture?
So Julie says, not a question. She just wants to say thank you for a fascinating presentation. I appreciate your extensive knowledge and enthusiasm. Cheers.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot to me. Because I really do get a kick out of turning people onto art and making it understandable and seeing why it's important. or why certain artists are important. So thank you. That means a lot to me. Anything else? Questions?
I don't see any other questions yet. People might be typing, but yeah, thank you very much for such an incredible presentation. I think that Andy Warhol tends to be kind of abbreviated, like we think of certain paintings, but his general life, the trajectory of his life and his art isn't really as well known or as understood, I think, as those little snapshots of him that we get just from knowing his most famous paintings.
Well, his personal life, he kept very private. You know, there's a new book that came out that talked about, like, a lot of people always thought he was like a voyeur, like he didn't really have relationships. In a new book, it sounds very gossipy, actually. So I haven't read it and I'm not sure I will, but it's saying that he had a very like strong personal life, very strong, you know, relationship and sex life. But it's very hard to get to know him as a person. I think a lot of people, even who knew him, didn't really know him. He didn't really talk a lot. You know, he just kind of said, wow.
Didn't offer a whole lot.
But yeah, he wrote a lot of things, and I think he had great quotes. That's the thing about a lot of famous artists. A lot of famous artists like Picasso, great quotes. Stuff you could say over and over again. It's like, oh, that was a really great quote. There's something in the chat. Anything else? So?
Kathy says, thank you very much. I only knew of Warhol and his art superficially, and I'm happy to have learned so much tonight.
Oh, thank you. Thanks once again. So, all right. So if there's no other questions, I guess we can call it a day.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody.